but let's jump into this. We're lucky to have Justin Griever with us today for the election special version of the VQMS. Justin is a professor of political science at Stanford and a senior fellow at Hoover. And so today's talk will be a bit unusual compared to our usual regular talks. It will be less about maybe more directly topics applied to quant marketing, and it will be more in the area of political science. But I think the two fields, even though people often don't interact as much, share a lot of similarities in terms of data, methods, questions about consumer behavior or voter behavior or other human behavior in general. And we're at the time when these questions are very top of mind for all of us. So we decided to run this special. Quickly on logistics, we'll go for 1 hour. For the audience members, please feel free to type your questions in Q&A and I'll translate them to Justin at the right time. Otherwise, for all the you can jump with questions anytime you want. With this, Justin, welcome. Floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to present this work with you. It's mostly co-authored with Eitan Hirsch, who's at Tufts, and it's timely. So we're running an election tomorrow, big election. We have no idea who's going to win, but there's lots of speculation about how rules about how elections are administered are going to affect who wins. This speculation's bipartisan. So this is Stacey Abrams. She was a gubernatorial candidate in Georgia in 2018 and again in 2022. In 2018, she famously refused to concede, citing the ways in which the election was run as a reason for her defeat, including the signature matching policy in Georgia. Even recently, even as Georgia's experiencing record early voting turnout, she said, look, the way these rules have been administered have been suppressing the vote. She's not alone. After a bill was passed in Georgia in 2021, Joe Biden labeled that bill Jim Crow 2.0 because he made the argument it would deter voters. This has led to a big operation on the Democratic side, with lawyers like Mark Elias litigating cases across the United States, alleging that how elections are being administered is going to systematically disadvantage Republican candidates. And this has even bled into some theories of how democracies work. So this is a quote from Levitsky and Ziblatt's latest book, where they say, look, the Republican Party is facing a minority coalition. So what they're going to do is change the strategy of how they run elections in order to increase their likelihood of winning. This is, as I said, bipartisan. And so you've likely heard a lot about this from the right, particularly this election. You even hear the same complaints, just sort of the flip side of them. So this is in Georgia, an image of John Eastman testifying before a ad hoc Senate committee in Georgia in December of 2020. Here, he's complaining about the signature matching rule as well. Abrams said it was too strict. Here he's saying it's too lax. So there's lots of debate about that sort of rule. Trump famously complained about election rules regularly, saying they don't work out well for Republicans. And we've seen people like Elon Musk and Trump this cycle make the claim that the only reason that Democrats win elections is because some states don't have voter identification requirements. And this has continued to be litigated. So this gentleman is Carrie Lake's lawyer, Kurt Olson. He litigates a lot of these claims throughout the United States. So this is the current state of affairs. And it's an odd state of affairs because if you open a political science journal, you'd realize that there's just not a lot of evidence for these sorts of claims. In fact, academic studies consistently find that when we make changes to election administration policy, there are small turnout effects. Those have negligible partisan effects. And when we estimate the effects of these changes in administration, there's lots of uncertainty in what we're estimating. And so none of the full-throated conclusions coming from either side are really supported by much evidence. And so what I'm going to do in this talk today, by and large, is offer a very simple mathematical model to explain what's going on here. And then I'm going to explore some of the less obvious implications of this model. And I will flag from the beginning that political scientists do use sophisticated methods. I don't want you to think this is the only kind of methodology we use, but I am going to be multiplying 3 small numbers together to reach a smaller number, 3 small fractions to reach a smaller fraction. That's the fundamental insight of this talk. And I apologize if it's blindingly obvious, but we'll see. It's going to it'll have some payoffs. So why is this the case? Why do we reach these conclusions? Well, we're going to show you a simple model for this, that modern reforms to election administration are going to target small shares of the electorate. Among the people who are targeted by these reforms, there's going to be very small effects on their turnout, and because of the structure of how modern reforms are just implemented, they're going to affect voters from both parties. So these are the three small fractions we'll put together, and as a result, these policies just do not have a big effect on who's going to win an election. So let me just give you a super simple example of this. So let's suppose we're going to run a presidential election in a state, and the state is in the first election 51% Democratic, 49% Republican. And the Republican state legislature, a majority, notices this, and so they pass a voter reform bill, much like the Democratic Party often alleges happens. And this targeted group is going to have some new requirements that are apply to 4% of the electorate. You could think about this as perhaps the Republican state legislature put in place a voter identification bill, for example. Roughly 4% of voters don't have a driver's license, registered voters. And we'll suppose that this policy that's implemented has a big effect relative to other modern reforms, a 3 percentage point decline in turnout among this targeted group. And further, we'll suppose that this is a relatively precisely targeted policy. It's going to, among the people who are in this targeted group, we'll suppose that they're 60% Democratic. And so we might ask, what happens in the next election? So all the numbers we've given here are big for modern reforms. It's a big group to be targeted, big turnout effect, and relatively precise. Well, we have our electorate from the previous election. So if you're not targeted under the assumptions here, there's going to be no change. And we could talk about those assumptions later. Among the 4% who are targeted, 97% of them don't have their turnout changed, right? So they're going to persist in the same way. And then among those who do have their turnout changed, there's this 3 percentage point. Among the 3 percentage point that remain, they're deterred from voting, and so that's 4% times now minus 3%, so we're at minus 0.12 percentage point decline in turnout. And then among that group, we would observe the decline in vote share. So just to give you a sense of this, throughout the talk, I'll talk about the policy being on or off. This is basically like treatments being on or off. And so these are just histograms that describe the vote share among these various groups. So among the people who aren't targeted, there's a very slight pro-democratic bias. Among the people who are targeted, we see that it's very pro-democratic. Okay, and then if we turn the policy on, the people who are targeted and are deterred from voting can't vote. So there's no turnout due to the policy. But if we look at what happens in the overall vote share, despite this all being very big things, when the policy's off, the Democratic candidate wins 51% of the votes. But when the policy's on, the Democratic candidate's still going to win, and now going to just win 50.98% of the votes. So we're looking at a 0.02 percentage point decrease in the Democratic vote share, despite the best efforts from this Republican state legislature. Okay, so that's very small. You might be thinking, well, I'm being told that this is going to be a razor thin election. We'll get there. We'll talk about that. The effects are going to be so small that almost every close election would have bigger margins than the effects we're talking about. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is offer a very simple analytic framework for thinking about the effects of these election laws. And then once we sort of walk through some examples of that and some surprising conclusions from that, I'm going to talk about a fact that I think is underappreciated both in the academic and in the legal sphere, and probably underappreciated among politicians. So given the current state of voting coalitions, laws that many laws will likely disproportionately target minority voters and target Republicans. And as a result of that, you can see growth in the white-black turnout gap, while also having that policy be good for Democrats, which is very surprising. So I'll walk through some examples of that happening. Regular response that we get when we present these results is that this is the Democratic Party counter-mobilizing in response to these laws. I'm going to show you that there's really no evidence that counter-mobilization is going to explain these patterns. And then so I'll conclude the talk talking about some new work that we're doing that shows that we can't make inferences about the cost of voting from changes in turnout rates. That'll address some questions that might be percolating here. So really, what's the special session of your group here? So what I really want us to be thinking about, to take away one message. Tomorrow, there's going to be someone who loses. They'll lose on Thursday or something, Friday. If it's the Republican, they're going to say it's fraud. If it's the Democrat, they're going to say it's suppression. What I want to suggest to you is that both of those cases are going to be overstated. It's not going to be fraud that's going to cause Donald Trump to lose, and it's not going to be suppression that would cause Harris to lose. And this is despite the fact there's a huge industrial complex in both parties pushing these sorts of narratives. Okay, so let's dive in to the most simple analytic framework here possible. So we're just going to do some potential outcomes, and we're going to talk about two outcomes that are often of interest. So there's turnout, and the policy will be off or on, and then there'll be vote choice, and we're just going to frame this as the share of Republican votes. Um, because it's an American politics talk, it'll be Republican, and then one minus that will be the Democratic vote share. All right, so the causal effects that are often of interest are, for example, the turnout effects of a policy. Does a policy increase or decrease or have no effect on turnout? Um, and then there's also a partisan effect that people might be interested in. Does a policy increase or decrease the vote share for a Republican candidate? All right, and so just to get to my three small fractions to be multiplied together as a way to evaluate these policies, I'm just going to make a table where I'm going to decompose um, that vote share equation, decompose that vote share causal estimand into component parts. All right, so the first thing we'll talk about from a particular group is their vote contribution. So we can think about the size here in this second from the left column as the share of the electorate who's either targeted or not. And it's easiest to think about this as a share, so you can make apples to apples comparisons across different size electorates. Um, you could also think about this, if you want to think about it numerically, you could think about the size as literally the number of voters, and everything would go through. Um, so we can think about the contribution that's going to come from this group as its size times the rate at which it turns out. This is the contribution when the policy's on. Notice the size of the group is not affected by whether the policy is on or off. It exists outside the policy being implemented. And then the vote share from a particular group is just going to be the share of the electorate that is either targeted or NT not targeted, in this case, when the policy is on. So here we're just characterizing the proportion of the electorate who comes from this targeted group or not. Um, and then, not surprisingly, what we can do is we could just say that the vote share for Republicans is the vote choice among people who are targeted and their share of the electorate, plus the vote choice among people who aren't targeted times their share of the electorate. So it's just a weighted average of those two proportions. You do the same thing when it's turned off. And the reason this is going to be useful is we're going to plug in numbers here to try to explain why many of these policies have a small effect. Okay, so just giving this simplest possible equation here, and we're just going to explain these differences. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to try to use some papers in order to plug in these estimates to explain why policies have a small effect. So here's example one. It's automatic voter registration. It's my personal favorite change to election administration policy out there. It's basically free money. I think everybody should like it. Okay, so this is a study that comes from Sylvia Kim. It's about automatic voter registration in Orange County in 2018. And I will say, I present this study, and sometimes people really want to dig in on the specifics here because some of the numbers will be big. Um, there's a lot of reasons to believe this study, but the example goes through even if you want to dispute some of the like some of the causal estimates that Sylvia has. Okay. So lots of people move. Lots of people move within a county. So we might estimate that among voters in Orange County, about 7% moved within the county in 2018 and would make use of this automatic voter registration. 93% don't. Um, if you are not someone who moves, automatic voter registration is not helpful for you. You don't need to re-register. But if you are someone who moves, Sylvia's paper estimates that there's a 6 percentage point increase in the turnout rate. So it's a big increase, very, very big increase in the turnout rate. Um, but it's still a surprising conclusion. This doesn't have much of an effect on vote choice. And that's because the people who move in Orange County and the people who don't tend to vote for Republicans at basically the same rate. Okay. And so if we use these point estimates of the Republican choice, we end up with a 0.006 percentage point pro-Republican shift in vote share from a policy that increases turnout 6 percentage points. And that's just because there's not much difference in the people who are targeted or not. So we wouldn't expect there to be much effect on their downstream voting. Obviously, there's lots of ways to try to estimate the partisan preferences of the people who turnout, sorry, of the people who move or don't. And so you could put down a Mansky style bound on that, and that would just reflect that depending on how you want to estimate these different groups, you could reach very different conclusions. So lots of uncertainty about the effect if you're not willing to grant my point estimates here of the vote choice. All right.
Justin,
Please.
can I ask a question about this
Please.
non-targeted group? So the turnout rate does not change for that group. So is that an assumption or is that like empirical finding
Yeah.
in the space?
So many of the causal designs will be based on the assumption that this would be true. So let me just walk through why I think this might be true in this case. So in this case, automatic voter registration just says when you go to the DMV to update your driver's license, they're just going to take that information and port it over to the election bureau. And so in that case, if I'm not interacting with the DMV, it won't really affect my life at all, and there's no way in which it would, change my voter registration status, for example. In other settings, we could think that there could be ways in which the non-targeted group, people who aren't directly subject, do have their turnout probabilities changed even slightly. So, for example, with voter identification laws, we mostly think about the targeted group as people who don't have identification, but there's some very small subset of the electorate who forgets their driver's license sometimes, and they would show up to vote and then not have it. And that would be somebody who has a license, they're not in the targeted group, but might have their turnout decreased. That's a small change, but that's definitely a thing we could build in to our examples if we think it was going to make a big difference.
Yeah, just curious if it's something you or others in the field have studied, because it feels like the small effect comes down to the target group tends to be small.
Yeah.
In many cases, you feel like these different rules can have an impact on the non-target groups and their, even their choice about whether to show up or not.
Yeah. So just a couple ways in which people have tried to study that. So sometimes there are studies that show people who are related to felons will turn out more after the person is removed from the rolls, if I'm getting the conclusion correct. So that would be an example of a non-targeted person participating more. There are designs on voter ID that look at overall turnout. So most of the papers I've written have looked at comparing people with and without IDs. But there are designs that look at overall state turnout, and that would address whether there's changes in the non-targeted group as well. That sort of design. So it is, it really depends on the case, I think, where you'd want to dive in. And some people have studied it, and depending on the specific policy, it's more or less relevant.
And
Okay,
Justin,
please.
quickly to sort of follow up on that, maybe, one nuance is if I, think about strengthening democratic institutions and having automatic voter registration or having, voter ID laws, that's a policy position that I care about as a non-targeted person. And given that, we're in 2024 and, it's been part of the conversation, this sort of exogenous, that I feel is a dimension that, people would take into account given the rhetoric around these elections over the past, let's say, decade.
Yeah, so traditionally, lots of folks have studied how the imposition of voter ID laws affect things like confidence in the election, and we don't see much evidence that that changes there. I'm going to show you results from a study that people have cited to say, well, even though people may have ID, they get animated, they get excited because they're mad about ID laws being put in place. But that study actually is sort of incorrectly cited. When we actually look at the evidence from that study, we find there is no evidence that people are getting excited because of ID laws being placed on other individuals. But it is certainly possible that you could have this sort of psychological component to it or a confidence component to it. And I think that would then, you could say, well, suppose I think everyone's targeted, right? And then you could just go through the change in vote choice, the change in turnout and the change in vote choice. And usually those two things are also not change in vote choice, change in turnout, and then the vote choice of people who are affected. And usually those two things are sufficiently small that you're gonna end up with small effects as well. So it is certainly not the case, for example, that when voter ID laws are put in place, you see a big spike in turnout or you see a big drop in turnout in the aggregate level. When you have all mail voting put in place, it increases turnout by maybe a percentage point, for example. But then there's not a big partisan effect, or the partisan effect will vary a lot by states. But I
Justin,
definitely, yeah, go ahead.
just to follow up also on Janning's question, how meaningful is it to run this exercise? I get your point about the small magnitudes, but how meaningful is it to run it with past numbers, knowing that if you start changing some of the rules, maybe not for automatic registration, but for some other rules, some groups will become the target, and they are going to be bombarded, right? They are going to become the target of campaign. They're going to, and their vote share or choices might look different compared to the past numbers.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly there's not, a theorem here that says every change to election administration must have a small effect. And in the paper, we talk about, the one example where there's an obvious huge effect in change election administration, that's Jim Crow laws in the early 20th century South. And there it's, super clear what's going on there. I would say that it's useful both to do this in past numbers. Like, for example, the exercise I'm about to engage in is going to show you that a Supreme Court case that fundamentally changed the way election laws are interpreted was fought over basically 170 ballots for Republicans. So that's a very small number. So it provides, I think, context for the scope. And then it also, I think, prospectively, as we think about these laws going into place, it's helpful for characterizing at least the categories of harm that we might think be going on. So there's lots of concerns when laws get passed that this is going to isolate Democrats from being able to vote, or this is going to enable Democrats to commit lots of fraud. That's what the partisans on each side say. I would say that if you're going to make that kind of claim and you're going to do it seriously, you want to put it into a framework like this, where you can just show where the ballots are going to be coming from. And even taking the rhetoric from like the most activist people, you just sort of put it in this framework and you're like, oh, even under your worst case scenario, you're talking about 500 ballots. So that's not swinging the election. You could be worried about it for lots of other reasons. There's a whole bunch of normative reasons why you may not like any one of the policies I talk about today. But that's different than saying my side is fundamentally disadvantaged because of the existence of this rule. Okay, so here's
Can I ask one more thing related to Pinar's question, which is,
Yeah.
should we be thinking about these potential outcomes as being just the policy or the policy plus party and candidate reaction?
Totally. Yeah, I'm going to get to countermobilization. I want to think about it as everything: party reaction, candidate reaction. And then the question that we could ask later that would, sort of undermine the thesis of what I'm telling you would be, if the parties are acting in a way that mitigates a lot of these policies, then we should be, very concerned about the policies perhaps. What I'm going to show you is that we just don't have really good evidence that countermobilization works. And just to preview those findings, there's going to be two things going on there. So first off, every campaign forever has responded to the rules of how that election is going to be administered, right? So if we want to think about countermobilization, you really want to be thinking about how is a campaign different in light of this set of rules passed relative to some other set of rules. So that would be the relevant counterfactual. But when we set that up, even in studies where the claim has been made that they've found evidence of countermobilization, you could very quickly see that at best it can account for, thousands or tens of thousands of a percentage point of vote share within a state, even under very favorable assumptions. And so I think the best evidence is going to point that this is the dynamics I'm showing here are the result of not the parties or anyone else trying to mitigate the effects of the law, but just that these laws tend to target relatively small groups of people. Okay. All right, I'm going to give this second example here. It's relevant because it's from the swing state of Arizona, although Arizona has dramatically changed the way they administer their laws. But this ruling is a massive ruling, really changed the way that courts are going to decide Voting Rights Act cases. So it's Brnovich versus DNC. And a big chunk of this is about how out of precinct ballots in Arizona will be counted in the 2016 election. Okay, so under a policy in Arizona that was being challenged by the DNC, if a ballot is cast out of a voter's precinct, it didn't count. All right. And so Jonathan Rodden, my colleague, wrote a really excellent expert report for this case. And in that expert report, he says, look, it looks like there's about 3,800 out of precinct ballots that were cast in the 2016 election. And what's important here is that when this policy is on, none of these ballots would be counted. And when the policy is off, all of the ballots would be counted. So this is a massive turnout effect because it's after the ballot has been submitted, they're making a decision about whether it should be counted or not, right? So this is as big as a turnout effect as you can have. So you turn the policy off, all these ballots would be counted, turn it on, and all the ballots aren't counted. And then the interesting question then is, okay, how much does this benefit either party? So one strategy that we used in order to come up with an estimate of this was to use the race of the voters who are casting out of precinct ballots to estimate vote choice using the cooperative election study. And if we do that, we end up with an approximate 177 vote Republican shift. And so under those estimates, turning the policy off would decrease the 2016 Trump vote share by 0.007 percentage points. So it's a very small difference. You can do a Mansky style bound on the votes. And if you do the Mansky style bound on the vote choice for the people who have these ballots, at best, we could see a 0.08 percentage point increase for Republicans or a 0.08 percentage point decrease in Republican vote share. So this is a very small effect. It's almost certainly being litigated about a relative vote margin of like 150, 170, even in Arizona, which has seen just razor thin margins the last few cycles. This is smaller than those margins. Okay. And also, I would just say there's a lot of uncertainty in these estimates. It'd be very difficult to forecast the direction of the effect and could vary even across races within the same state, depending on how people split their ballots. So it'd be very hard for a nefarious state legislature to design a policy like this to surgically exclude people who they thought would undermine their party's chances. Okay. So that's a very simple framework. I'm going to walk through some of the less intuitive implications of it. And so, like I said, this Brnovich decision is a huge deal. And so in Kagan's dissent to Brnovich, which was largely decided with the conservative majority, she wrote, Congress saw that inferior education, poor employment opportunities, low income, all conditions often correlated with race, could turn even an ordinary seeming election rule into an effective barrier to minority voting in certain circumstances. And this has been a large part of a lot of VRA cases where even if a law isn't intentionally targeting minority voters, the argument's made that because it could affect low income or low education or low SES people, it'll disproportionately target minority voters or Black voters or Hispanic voters. Okay. So
Justin, can I quickly ask on the previous point, just to make sure I understand? Yeah. On the previous slide, when you talked about the estimate size and uncertainty around the estimate. So when we think about this problem, is the main issue it's almost impossible to measure precisely what would be the effect, and so it's hard to make any predictions about how this policy will work ex ante, or the main message is that we can measure the effects, and even if we can measure them, just substantively it has no impact.
Yeah, I would actually say it's both, and they're actually quite related to each other, because even if we say we know precise with point estimates of vote choice, those end up being very, very small effects. But as a result of that, as we try to be honest about our uncertainty in those estimates at all, that uncertainty is going to mean that it could tip in either direction, precisely because that effect size is so small.
Got it.
Okay. So an important fact to keep in mind is that most U.S. states, the low socioeconomic status individuals are disproportionately non-white and Republican. This is something that's happened in a big way in the post-Trump world, where low SES whites are now the most reliable Republican voting bloc. And by that, I mean the group that votes Republican at the highest rate. And as a result of this, we see that there are laws that can increase the white-black turnout gap and decrease GOP vote share. Okay, so I just want to think about what this gap is. The gap is just going to be the turnout rate among white individuals minus the turnout rate among black individuals. We can think about this when the policy is on or off. So this is when the policy's on here. All right,
Justin,
please.
Justin, sorry, quick clarifying question. So this most US states is like right now, or like I'm just trying to think about the dynamics of this. Like, has it always been the case?
No. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And I have a different talk that I thought about giving here today that's about this dynamic. That was the sort of grandfather of this talk. So the reason the polls were so wrong in 2016 was because previously there had not been huge education differences, and you could just weight on things like race, and it would reflect the electorate. But with Trump, we saw this massive polarization among whites based on their education. So college degree holding whites have now broken in a pretty serious way towards the Democratic Party, and then whites without a college degree now are much more staunch Republicans. And so there's a new book by Matt Grossman called Polarized by Degrees, which is about exactly this dynamic. And it's a complete reorganization of a huge voting bloc within American politics. It's sort of amazing it hasn't been covered much. It is a big difference. So, 20 years ago, 24 years ago, I'm giving this talk before the election, I would tell you college educated whites are going to go Republican. And that's just not the case anymore. And so that leads to this dynamic here, which is found across many, many surveys. There's lots of ways to replicate this. We're very certain that this dynamic is happening. It's very surprising.
So I guess on that point, should we think about this as this very contingent observation that one of the features of these rule changes is that they're hard to target in a very partisan way because of some recent contingent facts about vote choice?
Even if you go back in time, the sort of finding that we don't have big vote choice effects, that goes back to Indiana implementing voter ID laws in 2004. The studies that come out after that tended to find very small turnout effects and even smaller partisan effects. But part of what I'll show you here is that the underlying logic there people had, I think, was basically right in 2004, that if you targeted low SES individuals, that would help Republicans and hurt Democrats. And what I want to say now is that logic is gone. And in fact, I think we just need to shout from the rooftops as loud as we can to Republicans that they're not going to benefit by targeting low SES people anymore. And there's a law review article by Nick Stephanopoulos who takes the finding from this paper and he sort of builds on it. And he makes I think maybe the depressing argument that perhaps Democrats will switch their views on these policies and become pro voter ID because there's a good case it could help them in many future elections. But it is totally contingent on how the voting blocks are arranged in the electorate. Again, yeah, there's not going to be like a theorem here that's like, this is the thing to benefit Democrats or Republicans. It depends on who's out there. But I'll show you it's like happens in some very real policies. Okay, so this is just going to be a stylized example, but the stylized example is going to convey this basic idea. So here I have broken the electorate using the CES into whether individuals are black or not, and whether they're low socioeconomic status or not. And everything you see here and with the policy off comes directly from the CES. So we have the size of these groups, we have their turnout rates and the share of which they vote Republican. And all I'm doing here in this very simple example is I'm saying, suppose we implement a policy that causes a 10 percentage point decrease in turnout among low SES people and otherwise doesn't affect the turnout of people who are high SES. This is just a stylized example to make the point. And so you'll see in the table, that's all we're doing. We're going from 47.5 to 37.5 turnout. Okay, very simple. All right. And so we're going to do the same thing for individuals who are not Black. And these individuals, you can see, are very reliable Republicans. 57.4% of them vote for Republicans. Okay. And we can see disproportionately among the people who are low SES, those individuals are Black. All right. And so we can just use this very simple table in order to calculate turnout gaps. So when the policy is off, the white-black turnout gap is 11.1 percentage points. And when the policy is on, it's 12.7 percentage points. So this is a thing we hear a lot from people on the left or the Democratic Party. There can be policies that target low SES people that disproportionately cause Black individuals to be less likely to turn out. Then an argument that's made is that, well, the Republicans who designed this policy must have done it to benefit their party. And I'm going to show you that's not necessarily true. So when the policy's off, the GOP vote share here, just by multiplying through on this table, is 46.8%. And when the policy is on, it's going to be 46.5%. So in fact, under my very simple example here, turning this policy on, which increased the white-black turnout gap, actually harmed the GOP. And the reason for that is that those harms were concentrated for white voters among the most reliable Republican voters. Okay, so that is, I think, a big and important point, that laws that target low SES can actually hurt Republicans, even when we think the superficial evidence suggests it should help them. Okay, and I'm just going to go through, I want to be conscious on the time here, but I'll go through an example where this actually happens. And this is another policy that I'm pretty passionate about. So I sort of have this extreme view. I think everyone should be able to vote, even felons in prison. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's about normative outlook. The felon population in all states is disproportionately Black or minority. And yet the partisan effects of these laws are going to vary a lot across states. So the targeted group will be individuals who are felons. And then the question would be, what happens if they were to be granted their franchise again, depending on the state's laws? And so we took estimates from this organization called Locked Out. In Vermont, if you're in prison serving a felony, you still get to vote. That's, one extreme. In Mississippi, this is just an insane statistic, 11% of individuals in the electorate are not able to vote because of a felony conviction. It's just totally wild. And the turnout effect here is pretty big. So Michael Morse shows that when felons have their franchise reinstated, it causes about a 10 percentage point increase in turnout. Another way to say that is 10% of felons vote after they have their franchise reinstated. So we can try to estimate the partisan composition of felons and how they would vote using a couple different strategies. Michael Morse has some nice estimates of ex-felons from Florida. You can also use CES to try to, this big survey, in order to estimate this in a relatively apples to apples way. And when we do this, regardless of the methodology, we find that restoring felon rights in 19 states, there's actually a Republican shift. In 29 states, there's actually a Democratic shift. So there's no one way in which restoring felon rights benefits either party. And there'll be lots of uncertainty about who's benefiting from this, for precisely the dynamic that white ex-felons tend to be very Republican. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about countermobilization very quickly and make sure I'm not filibustering, so we're going to answer questions. So lots of talk, or you may be thinking in this talk, that some of the reasons why, when you go through all of these policies, and we have many more in the paper, you're not finding an effect is because partisan groups are countermobilizing. The first thing I want to tell you is that partisan groups also have an incentive to sort of misrepresent how they're countermobilizing. And this is one that I've had a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about for a long time. So there's this claim that was made after the 2020 election that Stacey Abrams, our gubernatorial candidate from 2018, I mentioned at the start, helped to register more than 800,000 new voters in the state, and that's why the state went blue. Okay, that sounds amazing. I'm all for people being registered to vote. That sounds incredible. Here's another version of the claim. Stacey Abrams helped turn Georgia blue for Biden. Her work empowered 800,000 Georgia voters to register. That's an odd verb. Okay. So this was regularly cited after the 2020 election, and the USA Today fact checker even rated it as true. And what I'm going to tell you is that it's totally false and an exaggeration. It dramatically misrepresents what happened. So here's what actually happened. So the organization that Stacey Abrams created called Fair Fight made a claim in a press conference that 800,000 new voters had been registered. And the reason they did this was to make the case to the Biden campaign to not give up on Georgia, to say you could still win Georgia. Okay. But this is 800,000 is the totality of every new Georgia registered voter. And then it still gets reported correctly in the New York Times in October of 2020, October 19th of 2020, it gets reported correctly in The Nation. And then it slowly starts to get reported incorrectly. NBC News ran it incorrectly. NPR then dramatically misinterpreted the NBC story. And as a result, you have this thing totally take off. And now it's become a sort of regular part of both Abrams and Fair Fight's rhetoric, even though there's no way it could possibly be true. So sometimes countermobilization is exaggerated. It's easy, as I mentioned earlier, it's easy to confuse mobilization and countermobilization. So we have a couple different causal effects that would be of interest if we're thinking about countermobilization. So first, we may want to know, how does a law change what a campaign does? Like, does a campaign spend less time perhaps buying TV ads and more time hiring people to help folks register to vote or to obtain identification? That would be a change in mobilization we could measure. But then the change in countermobilization is this tricky causal effect that says we want to know the outcome under the laws under the law being in place, where we observe this party's mobilization effort, and we'd like to compare that to the potential outcome where the policy is in effect, but the party does not mobilize in that way. So we have this, very tricky. Not remembering my jargon from my mediation effects, but we have this very tricky. Someone on the call knows this very tricky causal estimand that would be very hard to estimate. Okay, so we can try to start to get at this by looking at some simple estimates that come from other papers. So Quintani and Pons have a very nice paper from 2021 to estimating the effect of voter ID laws, and there they find no effect of the laws. But they estimate that there's a 4.1 percentage point increase in non-white respondents reporting that they were contacted by campaigns. So maybe campaigns are targeting more people after voter ID laws are put in place. So we can walk through how much of an effect this would have, and we'd use the exact same model that we've used at the start of the talk. So suppose that contact causes a 4 percentage point increase in turnout. If they did this in Arizona, and just sort of working through the math of it based on the share of the electorate who's Hispanic, which is the biggest minority group in Arizona, and the vote share of those individuals, this sort of effort would yield something like a 621 Democratic vote net yield. So that's still very small. And just putting that into the vote share calculation, we're looking at something that's like a 0.009 percentage point change in Trump vote share. So it'd be very, very small. Hard to explain that with countermobilization. Another thing that folks have brought up was maybe there's a psychological effect. And so there's a paper from 2017 by Valentino and Neuner where they make the claim that we suspect strong emotional reactions to public debate about these laws may mobilize Democrats, counterbalancing the disenfranchising effect. Okay, so that is this psychological claim. They run a series of survey experiments. They focus on one treatment arm relative to control with a news story about Black disenfranchisement from the voter ID laws. And then they create a dependent variable that's an index of a stated intention to vote, attend political events, donate, how much someone wants to donate, and then whether they'd want to volunteer to raise awareness of voter ID laws. That's the dependent variable in their study. They say, look, the disenfranchisement frame increases stated participation on this index relative to a control. But when we ask them to reanalyze this, focusing just on the vote variable, it turns out there's no effect on even a self-reported intention to vote. And this also, I would just say, is not all that surprising. You'd have to have someone who isn't going to vote, but then hears about voter ID laws, and that makes them sufficiently angry, annoyed, concerned that they decide to turn out to vote. And that it would be very hard to imagine who that person is, that they're plugged in enough to hear about the ID laws, but not already planning to turn out to vote. Okay, I have 2 more slides and open it up to questions. So we're building out on this paper in a variety of ways. So just want to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing subsequently. So we have a paper that Eitan and I that we're finishing now that is about measuring the cost of voting, which is another component that we're not covering in this paper. And what we show is that there's a few things. Even if you know the exact effect of a policy on turnout, that provides almost no information about a policy's effect on cost. And we can characterize that with an interval that we estimate based on the information available from turnout. And other attempts to measure the cost of voting either basically assume the cost, the effect of the policy on cost rather than estimate it. So we have a solution, which is about a series of survey questions, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. And then I won't spend any time on this. There's lots of concerns about voter fraud. It's likely how I'm going to be spending my next 2 weeks trying to squash voter fraud claims. And as bad as it is nationally, it's even worse in deep red counties, very locally. It's totally not tenable situation there. All right. So just to conclude here, there's just a lot of reasons to support or oppose election laws. All right. You could think that you have some normative commitments, you have a belief about what's right, you could be thinking about what's cost effective. Given the set of laws that are under consideration in American politics, it is not reasonable to support or oppose election laws based on their partisan effects. There's no evidence that any of the laws currently subject to debate have a meaningful partisan effect and a reliable partisan effect such that a party could intentionally design a set of policies in order to insulate themselves from electoral competition. And what's more, claims to the contrary, I think, are harming faith in U.S. elections. We've seen a lot of this from the right, but I'm worried that we could see a resurgence of it from the left, depending on the results tomorrow. And it's a bad situation. There's a lot of risk here because politicians, lawyers, and even experts in election litigation have incentive to exaggerate risks because that's easier for them to raise money or to get hired if they're willing to say there's something really bad happening. And this paper is our argument that we should be calibrating claims about fraud or suppression just with the evidence that's available. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Justin. So with this, we'll just open floor for any questions and a discussion. And you're slightly even early on time, so that's great. We can kind of continue we can go past the hour as well, but we'll continue with discussion now. Can I ask a very quick thing related to how to interpret the estimates again? So
yeah,
if I understand correctly, part of them, can you hear me well? I'm not sure if this is, yeah, okay. I think the part of the results, the estimates are small because it's hard to target perfectly a group that if I want to spread selection one way or another, I just don't have the right demographic. I don't have the right target audience to say, okay, if I can exclude only these guys who are 100% Democrat or Republicans by these characteristics. And you mentioned before there was a lot of realignment on these characteristics. So if you had to project next 10, 15, 20 years, is the demographic group which becomes more like very polarized and we can get in trouble because if we can target them, that will actually have.
Yeah, this is a great question. So in the paper, we talk about this a little bit, like what are the policies that would make us really nervous? And the first thing is that sometimes you have what you're describing in a post-election period. So for example, if I know if a ballot is Democratic or not, or Republican, and I can come up with just ad hoc arguments to exclude every Democratic ballot, that would obviously be very concerning and you'd have a huge effect in that very, precisely targeted. So that would violate the targeting rule. And so I'd be, very worried about that, which is all the more reason that you'd want to have these rules, developed pre-election. So you still have that sort of veil. You don't really know how it's going to break down. We can apply that logic going forward. If there was a policy that only Democrats, or a method of voting that only Democrats or only Republicans used, that would also suggest that if you can come up with a way to get rid of that and those people aren't going to go vote in some other way, which often isn't the case, but suppose that they would only vote in one way, then that would be a problem. And that's one of the things that's been great about this cycle is that Republicans have embraced early and absentee voting. And so that means it would be harder for a group to argue, okay, this is, bad for my side. And just very much on that point, when, for example, in Georgia, when they implemented absentee voting in 2005, Republicans did it, and Democrats said, this is crazy. You're going to allow people to commit lots of voter fraud by allowing these absentee ballots to be submitted. So it was like exactly flipped. So these things can flip over time. I agree with that. And there could be like perceptions of advantage. But as long as we don't see a total polarization in, for example, voting method, then the basic, mathematics would work. And as long as we're attentive to people who are coming up with these ad hoc post-election rules, and not to belabor the argument here, filibustering a little bit, but the most ad hoc rule was Trump in 2020 when he was like, we can't count after election day. And the reason he wanted it to stop was that every major city where all the Democrats lived had yet to report their results. That would be, the clearest example of it. And obviously that's not a rule, but it's the silliest version of it.
Got it.
Maybe related to this targeting question, I was thinking, beyond American politics or beyond sort of a, two-party winner-take-all system, one of the thoughts I might have is, it could be a lot easier to do this targeting in multi-party democracies, right? If you have a party that's like a regional party that's only popular in rural areas with poor people, all of a sudden, some of these things maybe seem very targeted to, hurt that particular, niche regional party. Is that something that you've thought much about, kind of multi-party setups?
Yeah. So the multi-party setup is very interesting. So let's just think through the logic of a little bit. So, if we're implementing a policy, and then again, if you can implement a policy that's just going to affect one region in a country, if that's something in the toolkit for the person designing the policy, that's very valuable for someone trying to exclude a group or encourage a group. And then one of the facts about American politics, that's basically not possible. You're going to apply this broadly. You can't write rules just for a county, for example. But yeah, so if you can do that sort of targeting, then it could be very valuable. The multi-party is interesting in lots of ways because you probably have to put a coalition together to even pass those rules. And so I'd imagine it's like even harder to do something that would be particularly onerous for one group unless your coalition all agrees it'd be best to exclude that group one way or the other.
Justin, what would you say about the local elections and maybe more regional heterogeneity, and if this would necessarily the same sort of set of expectations would apply to those? I don't know if you looked at them. And second, that it happens, that it's basically that indeed we don't have to worry about we don't expect a major change even for the local elections. Why do you think politicians are engaging in these maybe the push for certain rule changes? Is it a way to distract attention?
Yeah, so I think all of this logic goes through to local elections or congressional elections. You might think, okay, it's regularly I've characterized margins of 1,500 or something as small, and folks will point to congressional races. And they'll say, well, not many, but some congressional races are decided by 1,500. Of course, the size of the electorate also has to shift down. So if you apply the logic, you're sort of dividing the whole way through, you end up with smaller votes. So I definitely think it applies in these local cases. So what's going on with politicians and why are they doing this? So I think there's a couple things happening. So nationally, I think there's an unfortunate race to the bottom incentive. So I think Democrats have found out they can fundraise very effectively by making claims about suppression. And it's certainly the case that Republicans have found out that they can mobilize and fundraise very effectively by making vague claims about fraud. And so that leads to this bad situation where both sides have incentive to make these public claims. They never actually put much meat on those claims. They don't say very specific things. And when you then look in court proceedings and you see the very specific things, you realize that they're fighting over these very marginal number of votes, but it's a huge money grab for them. And then I think I've spent a bunch of time with a couple of my grad students. We're doing an ethnography of people who believe very extreme voter fraud conspiracies, that every election everywhere is being manipulated by Mark Zuckerberg, for example, is one that I just came back from Coos County, Oregon, and that was a belief that people on their county commission had. There, what's going on is they have heard these things, for example, from Trump, and they really believe it. But the conspiracy is so vague that because they believe it, any small piece of evidence then reinforces their belief in that conspiracy. So, for example, in Coos County, during a primary, they printed a barcode that would indicate whether the ballot was Democratic or Republican. That's normal. The party you participate in for a primary in Oregon is public record, but that was then used as evidence of, some broad conspiracy happening. And so there, I think it's an instance of true belief, and they're sort of, wrapped in this conspiracy theory, and they can't get out of it.
Justin, I've been reading about these kind of volunteer election security volunteers who show up at polling locations and try to ensure that voting is secure, but it's also kind of this underhanded suppression tactic. So I'm trying to think of, okay, maybe election rules can't target suppression in a way that gives a party an advantage, but could these kind of frictions that are not rules, but just frictions that people take up on the ground, could those lead to bigger effects than what you're finding here?
Yeah. So we could just sort of reason through how some of that could happen. So, one thing that could be happening is that these folks, they get their efforts covered and people are nervous about going to the polls, and they may just decide not to go at all. Another thing could happen is that you show up and you see these crazy people there and you don't want to participate. So I've not seen a study that's tried to estimate the effect of either of those. Everything I know about these sort of volunteer individuals is that they're a small group of people, and the security is such around in-person voting in the United States that they're relatively excluded, so they both won't be able to make a scene and shouldn't ever be in contact with voters. That's not to say they don't have a big effect. Even if they don't have an effect on turnout, these people are making lives of election officials very difficult. And so, adding just immense amounts of stress to the people who run our elections. But I don't suspect they would have a big effect on turnout. This has been a thing people have been concerned with for a while, that at various points, people from either party will show up at the polls and intimidate people or something like that. And you sometimes see like video of it happening, but usually it's pretty localized. There's so many precincts, for example, tomorrow, it would be nearly impossible to cover them all with people like this. So I wouldn't expect there to be a big effect.
All right.
Justin,
Anything?
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Good. Okay. Just maybe a quick follow-up on the idea of frictions. And one thing that I was thinking of, like these are small estimates, small numbers, and trying to benchmark that against, something slightly different, such as weather,
Yeah.
right? So, I live in Pittsburgh. Both the candidates are here, but over the past couple of days, I've been checking the forecast, and it's going to be, nice, warm and sunny tomorrow. So, probably the turnout is going to be large, but like, what does the literature say in terms of, the numbers? And I'm just trying to get my head around what matters,
Yeah. So the big thing, if you want to look at like turnout increase, it seems to be the candidates who are on the ballot. That seems to be the big thing that gets people out.
Mm.
And the unfortunate reality is, it seems like, unfortunate, depends on your view. I'll maybe show my cards here, but Donald Trump has just reinvigorated participation in American elections in a way that's really unrivaled. Wasn't true in 2016, but starting in 2018, we've really just seen this spike in turnout, in part because Trump has created a sharp contrast that either people love him or hate him, and so they want to participate. So I think candidates being on the ballot is the first big thing. The evidence on rain is a little mixed. It is rain as an instrument to understand like cost of voting. It's one of the many rain instruments out there. Those are pretty small effects as well. If people want to turn out to vote, they vote. And just the reason for why would that be? In most places, there's not going to be long lines on election day, so you're just walking in. If you're in a variety of, Midwestern locations, you're sort of baking into your day that it might be a little rainy or snowy or something as you're walking in somewhere. So that's not a huge impediment. But that's not to say, that big differences in weather can't affect things. For example, a place to watch is Western North Carolina, where there could be huge differences in turnout depending upon how people are reacting to the hurricane. So it could have an effect. The effects of I guess, in summary, the effect of the laws are minuscule relative to the effect of candidates. Who's on the ballot? That really seems to be driving people.
Understood. Thank you.